Okay, good afternoon. Welcome everyone to the Friday Lunch and Learn for Alumni Weekend with Dr. Fred Johnson. My name is Kim Mendels and I am the director of the HASP program here at Hope. HASP is the Hope Academy of Senior Professionals, a lifelong learning branch of the college for learning and retirement. And we are joining you from our newly renovated HASP suite over in the Anderson Workman building down on 8th Street. Where we have a wonderful classroom, library, reception area, and offices. And it's my pleasure to be with you today and introduce Dr. Johnson. A little bit about HASP. Before I do that, we were founded in 1988 by Professor Emeritus Dr. John Hollenbach as a lifelong learning program for people who are retired. And we do that through a variety of classes and lectures and study groups, monthly programs, cultural and service events, and members enjoy pursuing avenues of study and engaging in lively discussion and exchange of ideas. Lifelong learning and service opportunities have been our emphasis since we were founded, and we are now about 800 members strong, and we offer courses all year, both fall, winter, spring, and summer. Currently, our courses are all offered online and will continue to be through the summer of 2021, and then in the fall, we hope to provide courses both virtually and in person. If you would like to learn more about HASP, you can do that at hope.edu/HASP. Again, thank you for joining us this noon. It's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Fred Johnson III. Fred is an associate professor of history and has been at Hope since fall of 2000. Fred graduated with his BA from Bowie State College and holds both his MA and PhD from Kent State University. In 2015, Dr. Johnson also graduated with an MDiv from Western Theological Seminary. Prior to coming to Hope, Dr. Johnson served in the United States Marine Corps as a communications electronics officer, as an infantry officer in the Marine Reserves. Subsequently, he worked as a production scheduler for Packard Electric Division of General Motors, an operations specialist for Contel Page Telecommunications, and as a corporate trainer for aircraft braking systems in Akron, Ohio. Dr. Johnson's primary field of study is 19th century US history, specializing in the Civil War. His other areas of expertise are 20th century US military, and Africa. Currently, Dr. Johnson is completing a proposal for a course on the history of the Black Church and is revising his dissertation for publication. Johnson is an award-winning public speaker and has been a member of the Toastmasters since 2004. Advancing to the semifinal rounds of the World Series of Public Speaking in 2007, 8, 10, 14, 16, 17, and 18, winning second place in 2017 and 18. And this year in 2021, he's competing again and is seeking to win the championship for Toastmasters District 11 that will qualify him to participate in the semifinal and final rounds. Dr. Johnson has received numerous honors and awards for faculty achievement at Hope. Hope students have chosen him to be the keynote speaker at commencement and recognized him with the Hope Favorite Professor Award twice. He has twice been asked in 2010 and 21 by the Hope Mortarboard Honor Society to deliver their last lecture presentation. Notably, Johnson received the DAR Medal of Honor in 2019. The award is given to an adult man or woman who is a United States citizen by birth and has shown extraordinary qualities of leadership, trustworthiness, service, and patriotism. I had the honor of being at that ceremony when Fred was awarded this honor, and I can assure you it was beautiful and a wonderful honor that he was awarded. Johnson has been recognized for increasing the presence of minorities on Hope College's campus and for creating opportunities for our community to interact with people from different cultures. Along with Dr. Scott Vanderstoep, he co-leads the Vietnam May Term, allowing students to experience the Vietnamese culture and learn how the Vietnam War impacted the country. He has hosted several community programs to give the public the opportunity to educate themselves on the contributions that African Americans make to society. Dr. Johnson has authored 3 novels featuring African American men dealing with the issues of family, divorce, and faith. The first, Bittersweet, published in 2002 by Random House. Second, A Man Finds His Way, 2003, published by Random House. And third, Other Men's Wives, 2005, also Random House. He has also co-authored Tupac Shakur, The Life and Times of an American Icon, 2010, Thundermouth Press. Dr. Johnson has also submitted a book proposal to Louisiana State University Press for publication of Robert E. Lee's Priority Target, The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. In his July 2018 article, Why Black Culture Thrives Alongside Rampant Racism, was published in the Washington Post. Again, it is my deep pleasure to introduce Dr. Fred Johnson to you this afternoon.
Good afternoon, Hope alumni and scholars of HASP, and all of the scholars out there who have logged on for this session of the Hope Alumni 2021 Alumni Lunch and Learn. I will now share my screen so we can get started. The subject matter, the topic for today's session is biopsying America's democracy and the way forward. Now, just a quick moment here. A biopsy is defined, or one of the many definitions I found, a biopsy can be defined as a way of diagnosing diseases in which a sample of tissue or cells is examined to look for signs of and to determine the extent of disease. The tissue for a biopsy is normally taken from a living subject. And biopsy comes from the Greek words bios, meaning life, and opsis, meaning a sight. Together, they mean to view life. So it strikes me then, in putting this together, that it is appropriate for us to take a view at life in the United States, as it's been for the last couple of years, at least, especially the last year. America is a living subject that we want to biopsy, to take a sample of, take a view of, to see what's been going on inside of this great country. To do that, I think it's appropriate, and of course it's my default as an historian, to go back to the past. Now, this particular statement, what you see is what is past is prologue. This statement means so much to me because when I was growing up in Maryland, particularly when I went to college at Bowie State College, I would go downtown very often in Washington, D.C. And when I did research at the National Archives, every time I walked into this building, I walked past one of the main architectural features in the front of the archives, and there was this message: what happened before is what will happen again. What will happen again? What happened before is the beginning of what is happening now. And it seems appropriate that we should continue with that tradition of what happened before. So, in keeping with that, we have to ask, who were we in 2020? So much has happened already in 2021 that I think calls for a biopsying of who we are right now. But that goes back to not just 2020, but even before 2020. But starting in 2020, who were we? We were a nation, obviously, that was fractured. A nation that was so divided, so torn, so tattered, so compartmentalized, so atomized, everybody moving into their tribal groups, both physically, online, families breaking up, friendships that had to be either ended or rearranged. So much was going on in 2020. You can see it just from some of the pictures that people were taking. Here on the left, two people who supported two different candidates in 2020. On the right, a sign: in this house we believe love is love, science is real, Black Lives Matter, feminism is for everyone, no human is illegal, kindness is everything. On that one sign, there's so much that we could get into if we had enough time, but it just speaks to the great divisions, the great divides that existed between people in that year. And needless to say, the news and those divisions in America, that atomization, those great divides, were exacerbated, made even all the more impactful, made worse because of the continued presence of the pandemic known as COVID-19. What part of life did it not touch? Of course, it required the masking of people. It touched everything. It led to the social distancing of people being isolated, keeping them in a fearful, frightful fog. Everywhere you look, people wearing masks, staying away from each other, not being allowed to see loved ones, grandparents being kept away from grandchildren, caregivers who couldn't get to their loved ones who were in their final moments. I cannot think, maybe you all might know, but I cannot think of one area of life that wasn't impacted by or destroyed by this pandemic. So yes, in addition to the divisions, the pandemic made those divisions even wider. And then there were the losses. We lost so many people in 2020. There clearly is not enough time to go through all the losses, but just to give you an idea of the broad swath of the losses. We lost, for example, Senator Tom Coburn, Republican of Oklahoma, former medical doctor who had done a great time in the Senate. But we also lost a pioneer in Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a woman who not only made her mark by being a woman on the Supreme Court, but being a woman who practiced law to begin with, a modern woman, a woman who is a lawyer, a scholar, a mother, a wife. She did it all. And she made it look normal. She made it look easy. But back in her time, when she was actually starting her career, it was so unusual. It was so different. That's why she came to people's attention. So we lost her. She was the inspiration for so many people. And we also lost Senator John Lewis. Senator John Lewis, who born in 1940, this man was energized in 1955, the same year when he was only 15 years old. John Lewis was a teenager when the other teenager named Emmett Till, a 14-year-old Chicago kid, was visiting his great uncle in Money, Mississippi. Went into a store one day, and we don't know what happened because Emmett Till is dead. We'll never know exactly because he's gone on to be with eternity. But allegedly, he said something to a young white woman, Carolyn Bryant, behind the counter. And before long, two men, J.W. Milam and Roy Bryant, showed up at his great uncle's house, dragged that boy out, kidnapped him, beat him to a pulp, tied a cotton gin fan around his neck, and threw him into a river. Emmett Till's mother, Mamie Till Bradley, demanded that they hold an open casket funeral so to paraphrase her words, the world could see what they did to my boy. John Lewis was only 15 years old when that happened. A few years later, in 1965, when he's 25 years old, he was marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Alabama. 25 years old, marching across a bridge named for a Confederate Civil War general who also, for good measure, had also been a local leader in the Ku Klux Klan. What was he doing? John Lewis was marching at the head of a group of people who were marching for the right to vote in 1965. Let me make this very clear. It's 1965. It's after 2 world wars. And we're 4 years away from having men literally walk on the moon. And on Earth, people are fighting for the right to vote, something which should be as natural to American democracy as breathing air is to a human body. And yet, John Lewis and the people marching with him that day put their lives in danger and nearly lost their lives trying to gain the sacred American right. We lost him in 2020 as well. And then there were the other crises facing the nation. 2020 clearly was a year of crisis. We saw that with the former administration, people from different countries that had Islam as a primary religion, there was a Muslim ban. You know, we're supposed to be a nation where people have the right to worship whatever they want. And so, for many people, some of the religions in America don't make sense, and some of them are even repugnant. But there's a thing called freedom of religion that is a sacred, cherished part of this nation's heritage. And then, of course, there was the controversy around the Black Lives Matter movement. And many people saying, don't all lives matter? How come your life just matters? And then, of course, the ongoing debates and controversies about gun violence, which if you've been following the news at all this morning, a mass shooting in Indianapolis. A nation of crisis, a nation in crisis, a nation gripped by division, a nation isolated by the coronavirus, a nation that lost some of its greatest minds and leaders, a nation that had to even remind itself of its founding principles of freedom of religion, a nation where people had to say Black Lives Matter. The problem with the Black Lives Matter movement, is, whether you agree with that or not, is the fact that people had to say it in the first place. And then the ongoing controversy about guns. And then there was this, the thing that led to me doing so many presentations at Hope College and online around the country last year. The thing that happened when a police officer in Minnesota spent 9 minutes with his weight on the neck of a man named George Floyd. The entire world saw it. And before long, you saw a protest in Europe, across the United States, and Canada, and Africa. This was something that just couldn't be contained. 2020 was a terribly challenging year for a whole range of reasons. I'm only scratching the surface. So it was no wonder that, in addition to the toilet paper crisis that happened in 2020 as well, when 2020 left, I don't know about you all, but I could not wait for 2020 to get out of here. It was a year that couldn't leave fast enough. I'm not in the habit of rushing my life away, especially given with every passing birthday, I have less of it left to live. But 2020, I was happy to see it go. So hello, 2021. 2021 came, there was a moment of celebration, and just as we were starting to have some hope, just as we were starting to think that we turned the corner, just when there was news about a pandemic virus that was going to be able to sit up there and maybe let us get a handle on this thing and stop feeling so helpless, and stop feeling so isolated, and stop feeling so frustrated, and stop feeling so fatigued and exhausted with COVID every day. Just as we were starting to think that things were moving forward, January 6, 2021, American democracy had to perform a certain function called certifying the vote that had been taken in November. Now, you know, when I teach my 19th century US history class, I always am very proud. I mean, I love the part talking about the Constitutional Convention. And particularly when they drafted the Constitution, I talk about George Washington's first 2 administrations. And then I talk about the part where George Washington, after having served his country so wonderfully, after having given a life of public service, and to some extent, even selfless public service, George Washington was a rich man in a century where being a white man, slave owner, landowner, he could have just tended to his business and lived a comfortable life. But he spent nearly 8 years as the head of the Continental Army, putting his life and his fortune and his family at risk. He helped to put down a rebellion in Massachusetts in 1786, Shays' Rebellion. Then he was called to preside over the Constitutional Convention. Every time he went home to retire, he was called back out of retirement to duty, to service, to serve his country. But then at the end of it all, at the end of that second term, he did something which was called walking away from power. If you all have any kind of knowledge of human history and human beings, you know that it is not a natural, normal thing for human beings to walk away from wealth, power, and influence. That's just not how we're cut. That's why people always talk about how wonderful it was and how amazing that it was that Jesus the Christ left his heavenly throne and came to earth. He left that power to come here and live not just among human beings, but to live among the lowly. That is not normal to who we are. And not to say that George Washington was emulating Jesus. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. But it just is not normal for someone to simply walk away from power, particularly when you're like George Washington. He was at the height of his power. Some people have speculated that if he wanted to, he could have been president for life. But George Washington said, no, I'm going to walk away from power. And when he did that, he established something called the peaceful transfer of power. And it had been going on ever since. Washington relinquished the office of the presidency, and John Adams took over. A peaceful transfer of power, something which is still, even today in the 21st century, is a rare occasion on planet Earth. But I'm sad to tell you, I can't teach that like that anymore. Not when it comes to the United States, and at least not for 2021. Because on January 6, 2021, the peaceful transfer of power devolved into this. A group of people, some people call them a mob. I guess it depends upon which camera angle you were viewing it from. Descended upon the Capitol, the Congress of the United States, where a vote was to be taken to certify the vote of the 2020 election. There were people inside the Congress who didn't think that the vote had been fair or free of fraud. There were people outside the Congress, obviously, who didn't think that the vote had been fair or free of fraud, or that things had been above board and transparent. Despite court case after court case, despite attempt after attempt to derail the process, despite the fact that no court agreed, despite the fact that secretaries of state who in charge of state votes around the country, some of them who were from opposing parties, agreed that all things considered, all boxes had been checked, everything was correct, all T's had been crossed, all I's had been dotted. The vote was clear, it was secure, it was transparent, it was free, and it was fair. The person in charge of election cybersecurity for the entire United States said it was the most secure election in the entire history of the United States. And yet, a narrative had been perpetrated for months, for weeks, that the vote was going to be stolen and that the results were fraudulent. So there we were on January 6, 2021. People who came with different ideas in mind, and if a picture speaks 1,000 words, I would venture to say that this particular picture is speaking hundreds of thousands of words. I don't know what other message you could get from this. Certainly for people in the African-American community, a noose means something given the history of lynching in this country. Democracy, I guess from the people that had this noose, was being threatened with being lynched. And then the melee ensued. The police had been deployed, of course. Then the rioters assaulted. And there's no other way of putting this. This was an assault upon the Congress, the seat of democracy, the seat of Western democracy, to include the United States Senate, what many people have called one of the world's greatest deliberative bodies. The violence ensued, and the peaceful transfer of power became a piece of history. As a Civil War historian, this particular picture was of great interest to me. You see, because during the entire Civil War, even though Washington, D.C. had been threatened, even though the Civil War cost nearly 1 million people, even though Washington had been threatened on numerous times in the first invasion in 1862 that ended at the Battle of Antietam in Western Maryland when Lee invaded the first time, and then the second time when Lee's second invasion ended up at the Battle of Gettysburg. There was a third invasion, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But in all those times, when the South tried to bring the war north to put pressure on Washington, D.C., never had there been a time where the Confederacy actually was able to bring a flag inside of the U.S. Congress. But on January 6, 2021, something that the Confederate government could not do in 4 years, in the space of a few hours, people were walking around inside of a house built by slaves, ironically enough, protected by African Americans and their white brothers and sisters, to bring a symbol of slavery and oppression into that house. They finally made it happen. The person who almost did get to the Congress was Jubal Anderson Early, a Confederate Civil War general. I won't take you through all of what he did. I think the main thing is just to know that on June 12, 1864, General Robert E. Lee, who at that time was down in Richmond near Petersburg and Fredericksburg, doing his best to hold the line against superior numbers of Ulysses S. Grant. Lee ordered Early into the Shenandoah Valley, directing him to cause a disturbance to distract the Union Army and to also harass Washington, D.C., with the hope that Early harassing Washington, D.C. would cause such alarm and such panic that Abraham Lincoln and Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton would telegraph Grant and tell him, you need to dispatch troops back to Washington because we are about to be assaulted. It worked. It bought Lee some more time, which was the whole point, to take some of the pressure off of Richmond, Petersburg, and Fredericksburg. Early took off from Richmond and rode west to Salem, and then to Staunton, and then to Winchester, and then to Harper's Ferry. And I can tell you, I'm from the DC area, what they call the DMV, DC, Maryland, Virginia area. Where I grew up in Prince George's County, Harper's Ferry is only about maybe an hour, 10-minute ride. That's if the traffic is moving in Washington, which is becoming more and more rare these days. But Early got to a place called Fort Stevens, which was only 6 miles away from Washington, D.C. and eventually had to retreat. Juba Early in 1864 got to within 6 miles of Washington, D.C. On January 6, 2021, rebel sympathizers got literally inside of the Capitol building. To biopsy this living being, the United States, we must first confront the history. And while I would love to spend a lot of time telling you about what parts to confront, so much of it needs to be confronted. I think that we have to start with not only confronting the history, but we must also confront the legacy of that history. You see, because history occurs, events occur, but just as the time that we're living in right now, the coronavirus is going to be here for a while. And if we work together, and if we keep on fighting this thing, it will become a thing of the past, but it will leave a legacy. What's one legacy of it? Consider how I'm speaking to you right now. This is Education 2021. In 2019, maybe I could have done it like this, but I wouldn't have preferred to do it like this. I enjoy being in front of you. Now, because of where we are, one of the legacies of the coronavirus is this way of speaking to you, presenting to you. This has become the new normal, as they say. There'll be other legacies of it as well. We must take into account not just a thing that happened, but the impact of the thing that happened and what that means into the future. Legacy. We got to biopsy that as well. When you confront the history, the first thing we have to confront is what happened in 1787. Confront that history and the legacy of that history. That history in 1787, there were many things that happened, but for American purposes, for our purposes today, the most important thing that happened was the meeting of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. You see in this very famous painting with George Washington presiding over the proceedings. And in 1787, of course, the founding fathers drafted that document, and the preamble said, some of my scholars of HASP will probably remember me saying this before, bear with me for the repetition, but the preamble says, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. May I share something with you all? I suspect that given what's been happening since 2016, if there were another convention meeting today to draft a constitution, they might say that some of the things that we want to make sure we have in the new document to be the foundation for the law of the land, that if we had to reduce, there's a few things what we want. What would we say they are? What's been going on since 2016? They might say, look, we want to make sure that we have a more perfect union. We want to establish justice and domestic tranquility, which has been very fleeting and elusive, if we've had it at all when we've had it. We want to provide for the common defense. We want to promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. The mere fact that people in a constitutional convention today might be asking for those same things is in itself insight into what's been going on for the last 4 years and for the last 2 years, to be sure. But in that 1787 Constitution, when they said, we the people, I always tell my students the following. When you say we the people, you also have to ask the question, in 1787, who was we? And this is where we get into the legacy of it all. You see, because in 1787, the legacy of we the people, we did not include Native Americans. We did not include women. In 1787, we did not include poor white people. We absolutely did not include Black slaves. So when you look at how a nation starts like that, when you say we the people in 1787, just exactly who are they talking about? And how can you possibly, with a straight face, say we the people and have Native Americans, women, poor white people, and if the Bible is any kind of guide to us at all, if in fact there'll always be more poor who will always be with us, how can you leave out such a big segment of the population and still say we? And then of course there were the Black slaves. And people were even in the 18th and 19th century arguing whether or not they were even human beings on occasion. So they had a great gulf of progress that they had to make sure to achieve. In 1787, the legacy of we the people means that there's a lot more not we the people, and that legacy of those who are going to be intentionally, purposely left out of the blessings and opportunities provided by the Constitution, even as it was amended to become more of a modern document, we live with that legacy right now. There are legislatures around the country right now, state legislatures, that are passing measures to restrict the vote. At the end of the Civil War, the Constitution was amended with the 15th Amendment that gave Black men, sadly not women, but gave Black men the right to vote. That constitutional amendment was ignored for 100 years. It was completely ignored, or the law just completely violated. And in the South in particular, they instituted things like poll taxes. You had to pay a fee to vote, literacy tests. Can you read the state constitution of Mississippi? It didn't really matter if the person that was administering the test couldn't read it themselves. Could you read it, Black person? And grandfather clause. Was your grandfather a slave? Yes. Well, then you can't be one either. At a minimum, that guaranteed 3 generations not being able to vote. A constitutional amendment. And the vote has been something that John Lewis got his head knocked in for in 1965, that people have been fighting for. And here we are one more time, debating and fighting for the right to vote, as people are working to shut down the vote, to restrict the vote. It is an old, long legacy that we must confront if we're going to move forward. Second, we had to confront the reality, not just the reality of slavery in America. You see, because slavery in America is too easy to talk about slavery. Slavery was both an economic system, but it also was a cultural reality, a political reality, a theological reality. In other words, slavery permeated every aspect of American society. It is like walking in the rain. You cannot go in the rain. You cannot experience water. You cannot come in contact with water and not have it also get wet. To be the one is to be the other. And slavery poisoned every aspect of American society. And that poisoning was occasioned by the hate that went along with it. It was occasioned by the fear. Let me be very clear about this. Slavery, the system had to be established inside the United States. It eventually grew on its own over time and took different shapes and different forms in different colonies and then different states. But over time, the ideology of slavery, the hate, had to be invented. Because early in the nation's colonial history, Black people and white people as indentured servants basically inhabited the same kind of miserable social sphere. It's only as you start getting closer to the American Revolution that the divergence, where Black people are condemned to slavery on the basis of their skin color, race that is. And then you had to invent ideologies and doctrines and beliefs about how this skin color is more deficient or more inferior. And then you're taught to hate it and then to fear it. And then it becomes part of the cultural norm. And then it becomes part of the cultural society. It becomes the norm of who we are as a people. So the fear and the hate, and also the greed, because slavery was always about greed, always about the needs of the slave owner. For those of you that sat through the class on the history of the Black church, I mentioned to you that the amazing thing about slavery, and this is not a positive, but the amazing thing about slavery was that slavery was such a consuming, omnipresent, wicked, evil force that those who perpetuated it were even moved to subject the Bible to meet its needs. I don't know about you all, that takes some serious guts to tell God that your agenda is more important than his, and that the people that he created are there to serve you as opposed to him who they want to serve. Everything was brought into subjection to this system. And as I mentioned, not one aspect of society was left untouched. And it wasn't just the slaveholders, even those who didn't own slaves. Because is it possible to live in a society where tyranny, which is what slavery was, where tyranny is the rule and not be affected by it? Sure, you may not be equally affected by it. The Black people, their story is easy enough told. That's not news. But can the people committing the oppression, can they walk away from it psychologically, emotionally, spiritually? What happens to them? Third, confrontation. We have to make a choice on the history and whether or not we want to be a society that is serious about justice or just us. Because for much of American history, it has been just us and justice every now and then for other people. We have to make that choice. We have to make that decision. It is a decision that's being played out right now. For example, when I say justice or just us, we're talking about the mob that stormed the Capitol on January 6, 2021. Well, in the 20th century, there was another type of gathering in the 1920s. Roughly just about 100 years ago, they marched outside the Capitol, the Ku Klux Klan, in 1925. And they marched outside the Capitol in 1926. And they marched outside the US Congress in 1927. When you have a domestic terrorist organization, and inside of that House of Congress are legislators who pass laws. Laws are a reflection of a nation's attitude about certain things. We say, for example, that in Michigan, the speed limit is 70 miles an hour. Why? Because I guess we collectively have agreed that to go faster than that is to put everyone in danger. So we agree that 70 miles an hour is too fast. We agree in America that murder is a bad thing. Why? Because culturally, we abhor murder. We don't want people going around thinking that if you murder someone, there'll be no penalty. So therefore, we put penalties in place. It is a sign of our beliefs, our values, our cultures, our way of life. Likewise, when the people inside the House of Congress who pass laws reflecting the values, the beliefs, the theology, and everything else that's going on, and they know that domestic terrorists are walking outside, one can at least begin to interrogate how do they feel about the domestic terrorists who are outside harassing Catholics, immigrants, Black people, Hispanics, the poor. Because it would appear that in 1925, 26, and 27, that the people inside that house of legislation that pass laws that reflect our culture and our mindset and our beliefs and our values and our theology, it would appear that given that they were fully knowledgeable of what was happening outside, that they were okay with all that. We're going to be a society of justice or just us? We've been given a warning, and the warning is this. I showed you all the slide at the very beginning. This particular slide came from an article in a publication called the Tehran Times. Tehran, Iran, our enemy, the one that calls the United States a great Satan. So this division that we have in this country, sure, it may be inconvenient for us. It may be problematic, and it may be traumatic, and it may be a bunch of other things. But there are people in the international community who are watching what happens in America, and they're circling like vultures. America has some serious international competition, and the United States is a superpower. Whether we want to be or not, whether people like it or not, we are a superpower with superpower obligations. And there are people that will love nothing more than to make sure that that superpower is diminished in effectiveness. And so for them, that division works. That's exactly what they want. They want more of it. And as far as Russia is concerned, they've been doing everything they can on the internet to make sure that those divisions get wider and wider and wider to make sure that we are a disunited States of America. We should take note of the fact that our enemies like Iran are watching this and celebrating these developments. Further, I want to share with you a quote from the movie The Dark Knight. I'm a big Marvel Comics and superhero guy. I like that stuff. And there's one scene from the movie The Dark Knight that I believe came out in 2012 where Michael Caine, playing the butler Alfred, says to Bruce Wayne Batman is saying, well, this guy, the Joker, he doesn't understand us. And Alfred says, well, Mr. Wayne, maybe you don't understand him. And he tells us about the story about a man when he was a younger man in the British Army in Burma. They're trying to hunt down these thieves who kept on raiding villages and whatnot. And they thought they were stealing these jewels, but it turned out these guys weren't stealing jewels. They didn't want the jewels. And so Bruce Wayne says, well, what do you mean, Alfred? Well, what were they doing it for? And Alfred says to Bruce Wayne, you got to understand, Mr. Wayne, some people aren't looking for anything logical like money. It can't be bought, bullied, reasoned, or negotiated with. He says, some people just want to watch the world burn. Scholars of HASP, Hope alumni. I cannot explain it. I wish I had an answer. But we are living in a time where it appears that people just want to watch the world burn. We have leaders that want to watch the world burn, and we have people supporting them who don't mind seeing the world burn. We've seen them before. Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, two people who clearly didn't mind watching the world burn. Pol Pot, who's responsible for 2 million deaths in Cambodia, a genocide. He didn't mind watching the world burn. Charles Taylor, who was definitely responsible for so much of the atrocity and misery of the Liberian Civil War of the 1990s that Liberia still has not fully recovered from. He doesn't mind watching the world burn. Truly, do we want these people being the ones that we're throwing our support to? But we need to remember, Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, they didn't overthrow the government. He was asked to be Chancellor of Germany. Pol Pot had support. Charles Taylor had a lot of mass support. Resistance true, and these are international figures who want to watch the world burn, but we have our own American variety, and they're growing in number. Reports say that domestic terrorism in the United States is the highest it's been in decades. Honestly, this came as no surprise to me because I tend to keep a watch on this kind of thing. I mean, just to be frank about it, as a person with brown skin in America, I can't afford to not watch. So when I heard that the increasing numbers of domestic violence, the increasing likelihood of domestic violence was on the rise, it was disturbing, but not surprising. Keep in mind what happened at the Mother Emanuel Church, for example, in South Carolina, when Dylan Ruth, a Confederate supporter, neo-Nazi supporter, Ku Klux Klan supporter, walked in on a Wednesday during Bible study and killed people. Why? Because he wanted to start a race war. He saw himself going extinct because too many Black people, too many brown people. To the credit and the great courage of the citizens of South Carolina and the city of Charleston, Dylan Ruth did not get his wish. The Black people and the white people in Charleston, South Carolina showed the essence of their courage and their humanity, and they came together to support each other rather than give him the evil that he so desired. But we cannot be naive about this. There are people out there that want that to happen, and like Dylan Ruth, they will do whatever they need to make it happen. So we have a choice. We have a choice of a nation that will dedicate itself to justice as opposed to just us. We can confront our history, the legacy of the Constitution, and the legal system of the United States and the politics and the economy. We can confront the legacy of slavery, but also the legacy of the suppression of women and their efforts to get the right to vote, equal pay for equal work. We can confront the legacy of so many things, the war on immigrants that has transitioned from the war on Irish immigrants in the 1940s to Chinese immigrants in the 1880s, to German immigrants in the early 20th century, Italian immigrants, period. A nation of immigrants that prides itself on immigration, that wages war on immigrants. We had to confront the legacy of just us versus justice. We have that choice. We don't have to be the United States of America, that this United States of America, we can be the United States of America, but we have to make choices, choosing leadership that does not put people in charge of the country who want to see the world on fire. I will take your questions.
Thank you, Fred. Friends, feel free to chat your questions into the chat option by typing them in, and I'll share them with Fred. Otherwise, some of you have the ability to unmute, I'm not sure, but we're happy to take your questions now. So feel free to go to the middle of your toolbar there where it says chat and type those in for us. You know, it might take a minute if you're like me. Sometimes Fred leaves me speechless for a little bit. It's a lot to process. There is a question here about whether or not this is being recorded and will be available in the coming days. And the answer to that is absolutely yes, it will be.
Good. Thanks, Tom.
Here's a question from David. Do you have a recommendation on how to create conversational space between persons who have such firmly held beliefs?
David, that's a really good question. I'm still working on that one myself for my family and friends that I've had. I'd like to recommend to you a group, an organization called the Colossians Forum. They model what they do on the book of Colossians, and they specialize, their entire purpose is to take difficult subjects like, say, for example, gay marriage, abortion, the kind of things that Christians fall out about, and to show them how to find ways of talking about these things and even disagreeing vigorously about them, but to not walk away hating each other. Differences of opinion is going to be a reality, but the breakdown of relationships does not necessarily have to be a byproduct of that. Will it be? Of course it's going to be. So it's not a question of will or won't it happen. Of course it's going to happen. The question is, it doesn't have to be so broad and so frequent and has such tremendous collateral damage. I would recommend checking out the Colossians Forum.
And also recommend Hope's website has our pillars for civil discourse.
And thanks, Kim, those are very good pillars too.
Yep. And I know we frequently refer to those here at HASS because we have many courses and conversations and different views of opinion. And so when we hold that up as a reminder, it's a helpful way to engage in those conversations. Another question, Fred, has come in here. If you have any ideas for solutions to stop the extremists and white supremacists.
The first thing that we have to do, I think, whatever is decided to do about the increasing instances of extremism and the white supremacists, it's not just the white supremacists. I would include Black supremacists, Latino supremacists, anybody who's talking about supremacy, exalting themselves over any group of people. The first thing to do is to believe that they exist. And I think so many people were caught flat-footed because they simply refused that they were out to believe that they were out there. It reminds me very much of the conversations about race that I had sometimes. And people said, well, in 2020, I had so many conversations. People said, I just didn't think it was this bad. And my response was, how could you not? What was not going on that you weren't getting? And so the first thing to do is to believe that it's there and to believe that it is as bad as it is, that it is spreading, and that the first step in treating any problem and resolving any problem is to identify the problem. Once we've identified the problem, once we've identified how serious the problem is, then we can collectively begin to figure out what to do about it. And there's another thing too that should be done. A lot of these people are being recruited, they're being radicalized, just like ISIS was radicalizing people. The same vehicle, they're being radicalized on the internet. I know it's very commonplace and it's almost like cliches these days to kick the internet, but the internet deserves to be kicked, especially some of the platforms like Twitter and Facebook that have the power to do a lot more policing. And yes, does this get into issues of free speech? Absolutely. But I always defer to this. The difficulty of free speech, can we do it? This is what keeps me going, Kim, or at least gives me hope. We put men on the moon in 1969 with technology that was prehistoric by today's standards. And if we could do that, surely we can find some way of having online platforms that will take the worst of the speech that appeals to the worst motivations of people and find some way of minimizing that or curbing it. And then, of course, we need to give law enforcement all the tools it needs to make sure that these extremist groups, that they are prosecuted according to the law, to the fullest extent of the law, when the occasion arises.
Great, thank you. Related to that, the next question, it's up to you if you want to answer it or not. Do you feel Trump should have been convicted by the Senate?
Well, let me defer back to my Civil War historians. I know that Jefferson Davis and a number of other Confederate officials were spent some time in jail for waging war, causing insurrection against their government. And I've asked my question several times. How is it possible that you can, if you agree that they facilitated an insurrection, because it sure looked like it. How do you get to incite a riot like that upon the house of democracy, and then retire to your resort community and not pay any price for that? So what that event said to me was that for many people around the country who have been frustrated with our political system, here it is one more time where somebody of wealth and access and power can literally get away with staging an insurrection and not pay for it. So I'm still waiting to see what's going to happen. And it was always an iffy kind of thing whether or not the Senate would do it. What I'm most upset about are the people inside the Senate like Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz, who couldn't wait to move to the front of the line to carry on the banner of tearing down the democracy. I don't care what they say about what they stand for. From my standpoint, as a prior United States Marine, it is some of the worst cowardice I've seen politically in my life.
Okay, thank you. Another one, Professor Johnson, great presentation. Do you believe that the Republican Party, which has moved nearly 180 degrees from its founding, can continue as an effective party with the current future U.S. demography support of Mr. Trump?
Yes, I think it can. In fact, so as a matter of fact, we need a strong Republican Party. We need a strong Republican Party. We need a strong counter to, just like the Democratic Party was the only party in power, we would need a strong opposition party, because that's how American democracy has worked. And so we will need people. For a time, people were trying to censure, Liz Cheney. I'm not so sure that I would ever agree with Liz Cheney on anything. But I'll tell you what I like about her. She's got guts. She's got guts. She stood her ground, and she understands that governance. See, it's not so much about being right about something. That matters. But what matters is that people going to the Congress who want to govern, and disagreements will occur. And the Republican Party can do that, but both parties have to be interested in governance, in governing the country. Of course, people have their constituencies, but you have governance. That means being more concerned about getting something done for obviously your constituency, but for the nation, and not kneeling down in worship, figuratively or even literally, to an individual. No single individual is greater than the United States. And we're in a situation like that, where the Republicans can find their way back, but they got to become a party of the people and not the party of the man.
Excellent point. Next, by making a choice for justice, we must choose to promote democracy over authoritarianism. Exactly what you were just saying. Do you have practical suggestions for promoting democracy besides making sure to vote?
Yes, we must become not just active in national politics, but state politics as well. So much of what's happening right now, you see the way this works is, and it happened like this during the first Reconstruction. When they were not able to accomplish their objectives at the federal level, they went back to the state level. During the first Reconstruction, because the Republican Congress at that time, what they call the radical Republicans, or more specifically the Black Republicans, because people back then, Southerners particularly, saw a lot of the legislation favoring Black people, so they called them Black Republicans. They were passing a lot of legislation, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, that abolished slavery, established civil rights and the right to vote. And so they were losing the battle at the federal level, so they brought it back to the state level. By the end of Reconstruction, in the election of 1876, they said, look, here's the deal. Since it was a disputed election, You get out of our state houses, you can have the White House. We want home rule. And so likewise, what's happening now, since the virus, if we want to put it like that, has gone from the federal level back to the state level, we got to get involved in local politics, because what's going on at the state level ultimately can have some tremendous consequences at the national level. And more than that, I heard a report on National Public Radio a couple of days ago. Senator John Cornyn, a Republican from Texas, and Senator Chris Coons, I think of Delaware, right, a Democrat. The two of them are working on co-sponsoring a bill or working together to do something to re-emphasize in our educational systems things like civics and government and history and political science. It's real hard to talk to people about governance if they don't know how governance is supposed to operate, how a bill gets signed or how it originates, how it goes from the House to the Senate or to the presidency. We have people, we have done a real good job for the last 20, 30 years of telling ourselves, we don't need to know that kind of stuff. Let me give you an example where that's important. I attended a global health conference in Ecuador back in 2019. And some of the people down there in Quito, Ecuador, you know, I mean, everybody was welcome from the different disciplines, but one person came to me and so as an historian, what are you doing here? I said, let me point something out to you. If you have a fantastic healthcare system, but corruption in government, and your political system can't deliver the healthcare to the people that need it, what good is your fantastic healthcare system? Because the healthcare system is a system, but if it can't get to the people who are sick, that involves politicians and institutions and rule of law and delivery systems and chain and supply chains, all that stuff. That's where the people that know government, society, and political systems, that's where that all comes into. We have to learn that and embrace that.
Good comment and question from Tom. He says, I was present at a lecture by Dick Gregory in Dimnent Chapel during President Johnson's administration. Should advocates for equality still try to hold close to Dr. King's theory of nonviolence, or have our divisions reached the point where peaceful change can no longer be achieved?
We absolutely should adhere. We should absolutely adhere to Dr. King's vision of nonviolence. Many people sometimes will interpret nonviolence as pacifism. No, it's not. Here's what nonviolence is. I just explained this to some students, I think, just a few months ago. Nonviolence is when you're Martin Luther King Jr. and you're going to go on a march in Chicago, still one of the most segregated cities in America. And you know that the people who are there are going to be coming at you like lions and tigers that haven't eaten for weeks. They're coming after you, but you go anyway. And you make up your mind before you get there that no matter what they do, you are not going to respond violently, but you are going to get in their face. That's called confrontation. To get in the face of somebody who you know wants to beat you down with bricks, bats, and all that other kind of stuff, that's not pacifism. And that certainly is not being weak and cowardly. That is simply saying, I'm going to make sure that you know that I'm here and you can beat me up, but I'll be coming back again and again. If we don't do that, if we decide to embrace violence, then the game is lost. This is why what happened on January 6th and what other acts of violence have to be spoken out against, have to be renounced, and we have to do better than that because we can and we have. So it's not just some nice thing. We have to have courage, the courage of our convictions, and then the courage to go stand for them, and then the courage to not respond in kind when people are resorting to hate, because what that does on both the left and the right, it gives people opportunity to say, see, we told you. They don't respond to X, Y, Z. We cannot give any kind of room for justifications for the escalation of greater increases of authority and authoritarianism because people are afraid. And that's exactly what violence will do. It opens a doorway for people to be afraid. And we know we have people in office right now who will exploit that fear for their own advantage. So no, we should not be embracing violence.
Related to that, the next one is if you would like to comment or could comment on the prayers and religious symbols that were part of the January 6th insurrection.
That's nothing new. That's nothing new. You know, I mean, the Confederacy, listen, before the Civil War, the Episcopalians, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Baptists, they all split over the issue of slavery. You know, they're always using the symbols of God and religion and theology to argue their various viewpoints. So I'm not surprised at all that people were able to sit up and take the word of God and justify assaulting the Congress, to stop the decertification of the vote. The thing about the Bible is that you can use it to mean anything that you need it to mean, but that's the caveat. Anything you need it to mean. The real message is, what does it mean to you? Not what you want to make it mean. So there were people who were using it, and it's been happening before. I have no doubt it'll happen again.
Oh, this next one's tough. Seems that law enforcement has been infected with extremists, particularly based on what some of the recent news coverage has been. How do we avoid that?
I don't know how you avoid it. First of all, let me revise that. I think you avoid it by better screening and hiring practices, better background checks. I haven't said this to my Hope scholars, to my HES scholars too often, but I'll tell you all now. When I was on active duty, it was at the end of a workday at Camp Lejeune. I'm on active duty, United States Marine Corps, Camp Lejeune. In my communication shop, 2 of my Marines thought that I had gone home for the day. I was just in my office working. It just so happened that the sun was coming in the window on my desk, and I was there, didn't need the light on. So since they didn't see the light on in my office, they thought I was gone. Well, I heard them talking between the 2 of them. And these are 2 of my best radio operators. These guys were, without them, I don't know that I could have operated my unit the way that I did. They were that good. But I heard one of them say to the other one, if we ever go to combat, that nigga better hope he watches his back, because he's gonna have a problem. And I thought to myself, is that right? So what they were telling me is that if we ever went to combat, in other words, if we ever went to war fighting America's enemy, I had to watch the enemy in front, but the one from behind as well.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that situation existed when I was on active duty. And I met other Marines who would tell racist jokes and whatnot. You know what? You kind of, at the time, I guess I didn't have enough courage or just enough maturity to confront it more directly. But you try to get along with people, you laugh and go, oh, you're just being silly, or you just kind of shrug it off. But that exists. And if we make that a criteria as part of somebody's entrance criteria, who have you been, where have you been, who have you associated with, or whatever kind of questions they need. I'm not saying they have to use those, but whatever agency is doing those background checks, and to join the military, you had at a minimum had to be, I think, get a background check from the Defense Investigative Service. If you have a secret clearance, a top secret clearance, top secret no foreign, in other words, the further up the chain you go for your security clearances, the background checks get even more stringent. So to prevent that extremism, and will you be able to stop all of it? No. Because human beings have a real good way of hiding who they truly are. But as much as we can to find people before they can unleash themselves upon that population, we should do it through the application process.
I don't know if racial sensitivity training is standard, but certainly should be cultural diversity training. Okay, next question is, even though the Constitution was not written for the excluded groups that you mentioned, what are your thoughts on the application for those groups today?
The application for those groups today?
Yeah.
If I'm understanding the question correctly, the Constitution has been amended enough to incorporate so many groups. Now we still have legislation, extra constitutional legislation passed, like the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, that have to go back and, oddly enough, reiterate what's in the constitutional amendment. I may be naive about this, Kim, but I just had this belief that if we finally, truly, once and for all, applied the Constitution as it has been meant in its amended form, truly applied it with the fairness and justice and equality of opportunity. And I say, let me be very specific about this. Equality of opportunity does not necessarily have to mean equality of outcome. It means that I don't want someone telling me I can't go through the door just because you think I can't do it. If I go through the door and I fail, that's one thing, but don't stop me from going through the door just because you think I'm less than or some other thing. If we apply the Constitution in those ways, I think so many people would be automatically covered up under it. But we keep on finding ways, and other people keep finding ways to circumvent the Constitution. And this really relates back to an earlier question, where they can't do it at the federal level, they'll do it at the state level, and sometimes at the local municipal level. And so, it's a constant, it's like a game of whack-a-mole. You hit one here, it pops up over there. You're constantly putting out it's not, if it at least were a different kind of fire, it might be interesting, but it's always the same kind of thing. Delay, distract, deflect. Delay, distract, deflect. That's why I said to folks, I don't want to sit on another blue ribbon panel, study group, or anything to talk about what's going on right now with regard to race or constitutionalism, because this has gone on long enough. What I'm interested in now is action. If you're interested in that, fine, let's move forward. But if it's to study to find out if there's a problem, let me help you. Yes, there's a problem. Now the question is, what are we going to do about it?
Okay, next one. Where do you think we will be next year around this time? What do you believe things will look like?
Well, it's really bad for historians to try and forecast the future. But if we don't do a better job of getting the people in our leadership who are being so irresponsible about spreading disinformation, about not being concerned for the people of the country, in many cases their own constituents, and to stop posturing and to stop believing and spreading lies. If we continue doing that, I can't see how we improve.
Or how we find a way to show the people who believe the lies that they are lies.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Ken. We have to find some way, but for a moment, this is why I said that, there have been different times in human history where it seems like people have wanted to believe the lies. I've gone back and listened and studied the speeches of Adolf Hitler. And I mean, even with the conditions and the tough situation in Weimar Germany, right before the Nazis took power in 1933, I just can't help asking myself, how could they have believed this guy? How could they have believed that this guy was going to actually follow through and be the great leader that he was? Now, some people would say, of course, if you were the mindset that, certain groups of people in Germany had been a problem, well, then given his policies, that would have been a good thing. But we have to, if we establish a good, close, loving relationship with the truth and facts, I don't know how we move forward. I don't know how we move forward if we don't demand accountability for our leaders to stop playing with the health, welfare, safety, livelihoods, and lives of the American people.
Here's an interesting question / comment is, who will check the backgrounds of the people doing the background checks, though? Which is a good question. Then this person asks, the Second Amendment, in my view, is a problem. It has too many reasonable interpretations. If it were ever addressed by a constitutional amendment, what changes would you propose?
I do not know. I'll be honest, I do not know. I have to, that's when I got to give some thought to, really, because that's a good question, because I was thinking this morning after I heard about Indianapolis. Yes. And like I suspect that many of you, I found myself thinking, I am so sick and tired of thoughts and prayers.
Yes.
Our thoughts and prayers are with you. Thanks. What are you going to do?
Mm-hmm. The same person just said that the problem being that every law pertaining to weapons, state, local, federal, by definition infringes on the right of people to keep and bear arms. So,
when I tell you what, when I have given thought to this, you look when the Constitution was written, 1787, when it was adopted in the 1790s. Historians are love to talk about a thing called context. Mm-hmm. And I mean, unless you're just going out, in the afternoon and hunting your meal every day, and there are people who are raiding your home, and we know there's crime out there. The context in which that particular amendment was written was in a post-colonial society where the British had been occupying the colonies, and people absolutely needed weapons because it was of course, it served British policy for colonists to not have weapons and for the British Army to have weapons. So people understood that the best way of fighting for your independence was not to be throwing sticks and stones at guys that had muskets, but to have one yourself. Okay, it's 200 years later. And
Okay.
is it possible that maybe we should upgrade the context and therefore have an amendment or laws that meet today's situation, as opposed to constantly adhering to the Second Amendment chapter and verse as it was written originally, and then all the permutations of interpretation?
Well, and we certainly consider context regarding when the Bible was written. So
That's right.
we should do the same with the Constitution. Related to that, a comment just came in that the Second Amendment requires that those with guns be part of a, quote, a well-regulated militia. This phrase is now ignored.
Well, a well-regulated militia has undergone changes as well relative to its meaning, and that's part of U.S. military history. I mean, for a time, the militia literally was a militia, and then state militias became, I won't go through the whole history, but National Guard, then eventually the regular army. So the military establishment of the United States has undergone changes. It may be worthwhile taking a look at that phrasing as well.
I think I have most of them, except for this last question here was from the same person who asked about where you thought we'd be next year around this time. The way it reads is, how fits the biblical righteousness in your advices?
How what?
How does biblical righteousness, I think is the question, fit in with your advice? But it's weird, the question is weirdly phrased. So if that person wants to clarify that question for us, that would be great.
Yeah,
but that's what it says.
I'm not sure I understand that question. I think that let me take a stab at what I think is being asked. One of the things that I learned that I came away from with regard to the studying in seminary was this, that God is too big to know. God is too big. I'll speak for myself. God is simply too big, too awesome, too powerful for me to say, I absolutely know that he wants blah, blah, blah. And here's what worries me. When people, whether it be an individual or a political leader or anybody, says, I know for certain that God wants me, really? You see, people have hidden behind the robes of God and claimed that kind of certainty of knowledge of what he wanted them to do. And that has usually been the premise for some of the worst crimes and atrocities in human history. Now, let me be very clear about this, because my colleague, Mark Baer, wrote a book entitled a few years ago, I think it was, about mere Christianity or mere Christians. He talked about, Christians like William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson and Grenville Sharp, Christians who are on the forefront of social change, social justice, ending slavery, fighting for women's rights, all those kind of things. Because it's too easy. People have too often said, well, religion is called some of the worst crimes. Yeah, that's true, but so have state religions like communism and National Socialism. So when people are talking, when people are claiming to, I don't know, say things like only I can fix this problem, that's problematic. We should interrogate that. When people are exalting themselves over a state or over a faith system. So if you're talking about that kind of certainty or righteousness, whenever human beings are claiming certainty or righteousness, I get nervous.
That person just added the comment that righteousness is all embracing in our state of affairs. Okay.
Okay,
the last thing is just our dear friend Peg Van Grauw is asking if there is access to the Colossian form in Holland, And if so, if you're able to elaborate on how or when or where one can participate.
I don't know if they're in Holland, Peg. It might be just good to contact them. They have been in Holland. I think a couple of years ago they did something over at the Reformed Church on 14th Street, over near the seminary.
Oh, uh-huh.
So they will come to Holland. I mean, what they do is they'll go to any church that they're invited to conduct these workshops. So all you do is give them a call. They're looking for places to go to.
Okay. I think Jenna also posted the link in the chat here. Another question, or I mean, another comment from
Sure.
Thomas is surely even non-Christians can achieve positive change. There are too many Christians who would refuse to acknowledge that.
I don't disagree with that at all.
Mhm.
Christians can achieve positive change, you know, and this is where I defer to Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, you know, believed something, but Thomas Jefferson was always like this. He said his concern, I'm paraphrasing, of course, his concern was not so much what people believe, but the fact that they had the right to believe it. That included the right to not believe it.
Mm.
And so, you know, the United States remains one of the world's largest multi-religious, multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-everything, pluralistic democracies on the planet. That doesn't happen if everybody's marching lockstep theologically, politically, culturally, or anything, you know, that makes up this culture. It makes for problems for people getting along, but that's what makes the nation rich and what gives it this possibility. So absolutely right. Non-Christians are just as capable of creating positive change as Christians are, and we should all get to work doing that. I work with, I have built houses with Habitat for Humanity, Kent County, and out on those work sites, there are people there who are believers and people who are not, but you know, they have one thing in common. They want to see people living inside, not on the streets.
Interesting question here. Can you say that you have recognized less racism in Holland since you've been at Hope and since you've, like, over the years that you've lived here now?
Can I say that I recognize it less?
Yeah.
It's a moving target. It ebbs and flows.
Mm-hmm. All right. Then there's just a comment that Christ Memorial Church has offered Colossians Forum sessions. So there's an FYI, make sure I haven't missed anything else. I think I've hit them all.
Okay. Well,
one new. Great work. Great presentation.
I have Hope alumni, Scholars of HASP, Kim, Jenna. I have so thoroughly enjoyed this. Thank you all for inviting me. It's been a privilege, and I look forward to being with you again. I really look forward to being with you all in person, hopefully sooner than later. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Johnson. Thank you everyone for being with us today. Again, the recording will be available within a few days, and thank you so much for joining us.